Hi, everybody. This is Stu. I had a funny note for you, just to let you know what a saint Patty is. The episode you're about to see, we had started talking, and she had gone through literally 39 minutes before I realized I hadn't clicked the record button. So Patty had to start all over again, following her notes. And like the saint that she is, she just picked up and continued on. So here's the episode, take two. Hi, everybody. I'm your co host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. And Patty has some very interesting tales for us this time. Ghost in the Machine, I believe you said.
Yes, indeed.
All right.
So I was thinking the other day about some things that have happened in my life and in the lives of those around me that made me think about the ghost in the machine. I'm a big fan of the old Stephen King stuff. And he had a story called The Mangler about working in a laundromat where this thing would fold the clothes, but it had gotten a taste for human blood and damaged and hurt people. And it made me start thinking about machines that have caused harm over the years. The first one actually happened to my family. So my brother Terry, when I was a teenager, bought this beautiful 1968 red Mustang. It was gorgeous, but it was also the most impractical car in the world for him because he had 5 kids. And this was in the days before you had to have seat belts restraints for everybody. And it looked like a clown car when they all came tumbling out. Elbows, knees, and heads, popping out of this car. And it was really cute. And he seemed to really like the car. And then about 3 or 4 months after he got the car, he stopped being all excited about it. And eventually he would come to tell me that he thought the car was haunted or possessed or something. Now, I have to tell you, he's the most rational person, and he's never said about anything being haunted or possessed before or after. So it's not like it's something he would think often. It all started with there's a road on the way to Altoona where he worked that goes through a cemetery, a little place called Frankstown. And they literally built the highway through the center of the cemetery. Cemetery is on a hill, and they cut the road through the middle of the cemetery. I'm told they had to move a few graves, and then they put retaining walls to hold the cemetery, walls in place so that it didn't come tumbling down on the highway on a rainy day or something. And he's driving through there one morning, and all of a sudden, as soon as he gets into that area where they're driving through the cemetery, the steering wheel takes on a life of its own, and it starts trying to steer him into the wall. He's fighting the steering wheel and trying to get it to turn the right way to get it back on the road. And he gets out the other end of that little stretch of highway and pulls over, and he's shaken. The steering wheel seems to be fine now, but it was literally turning in his hands by itself and defying what he wanted it to do. So he's very cautious driving the rest of the way to work. The steering wheel seems fine. All the way home, it seems fine. And over the course of the next month or so, this happened several more times, where the steering wheel would take on a life of its own when it got to that cemetery. And then it got worse. One day he's driving through early in the morning, and not only did the steering wheel go crazy, but all of a sudden he felt the gas pedal drop below his foot, as though somebody else had stepped on it and had just given the car the gas. So now he's trying to keep the car on the road. He's going way too fast, and it's trying to fight him and knock him into that wall. He's absolutely shaken. They decide, my brothers, that they're going to tear the car apart. They're going to look at the steering, and they're going to look at the gas pedal and see what's going on. Now, my one brother was a superb mechanic and could easily have made a living at it. And they tear the car apart. They take care of everything. They don't find anything wrong with it, but still, anything that looks slightly worn, they decide they're going to replace it while they have it open and take care of it. And at first, the first few days after Terry's got it back on the road, it seems to be fine. He takes the route he always took to work because it was much shorter than the other one, and seems good. And then it happens again. The car takes off on its own, and the gas pedal depresses itself, and that's the end of it for him. He gets the car home that night, realizes he's not going through that space ever again. He'll take the longer route. and eventually buys another car and parks this one. He puts it in storage. It's a beautiful vehicle, a cherry red 1968 Mustang in
Mm.
excellent condition. It was beautiful.
I can just imagine. Yeah.
And my sister, who was, born in 1968, thought she had rights to that car because of her birth. So she would always tell Terry she was going to have to get that car. At first, he would sort of say, "Yeah, that's fine, Georgie, we'll do that." Blah blah blah. And eventually, he told us the story of why he wasn't selling the car. And what ended up happening was he took the car to a junkyard because he was afraid to sell it. What if it did this to somebody else and somebody died? He'd feel responsible. And he told them he wanted to crush it. And they were like, "Dude, this is a nice car. It's vintage. It's in great shape." He said, "No, this car has to go." He paid them a lot of extra money to crush that car while he watched it, because he had to make sure that it didn't take anybody's life. Now, I don't have any backstory to tell you anything about, what the history of the car was. Just he bought it from somebody and he thought it was a great car, but it turned out not to be.
I guess not.
We think sometimes that we got it all figured out, and unfortunately the world tends to give us a different idea. So I came across, there's a lot of haunted car stories, I must tell you. And I came across this one about this little almost new red Toyota Corolla that this young lady had purchased. And she said that, at first it seemed like it was a nice car, it ran really well, and that's whenever she started to have issues. Her dad was driving her and her sister to the library one day in her car, and she saw an old man suddenly walking across the road. She was calculating in her head, "Oh my God, if dad doesn't slow down, he's going to hit this dude." And she starts to yell, "Dad, stop!" And in that instance, the car struck the man, but it didn't strike the man. There was no bump, no thump, no nothing. She turned around and she looked, and she was like, and they're like, "What is wrong with you?" And she's like, "Didn't you see him? Didn't you see the old guy?" And they're like, "No, we didn't see anything." So she's sitting there kind of confused, thinking, what the heck happened? Why is it that I saw it but nobody else? So she kept her mouth shut, and she got back to the house, and she was in the kitchen doing dishes that afternoon. She looked out, and there was an old man sitting in the front seat of the car, just sitting there staring straight ahead. She's watching him, and she goes to get her dad's attention to say, "Dad, there's somebody in the car." And he gets up to look, and it's gone. After that, things got worse. She would see the shadow of this old guy in the car quite frequently, not just once in a while. And it didn't matter what angle you were at. Their kitchen window actually was right where they parked at. They would see it a lot there. But if you went out to take the garbage, you'd turn around to come back in, and there would be this man sitting there in silhouette. And as soon as you got near the car, it would fade away. That was terrifying. But he never seemed to appear in the car itself when they were driving it, until one night she was on her way home, and she glanced up into the rearview mirror, and there sat the old man on the back seat. Well, you can imagine, she slams on the brakes, she's looking around, craning her neck, and there he sits. And she keeps looking in the rearview mirror and trying to find a place to pull over, and I'm looking back over her shoulder at this guy, and then he just is gone. She has no clue what happened. So this continued for quite a long time. In fact, she said it's never appeared to her again in the car, but she still sees it when she's walking by the car. She said, "It's unnerving to know that there's somebody who's always with me. He's never caused her any harm. He's never done anything terrifying, but he's shown himself to her in various ways. She believes he either owned the car or was struck by the car. She doesn't know which."
Yeah, I was thinking the latter while you were telling the story. I was thinking that he was killed by that car, and that
Yeah.
that may have been the last thing he saw, and that's what he attached to.
Yep, he imprinted on it.
Mhm.
So there's one last car story I would like to tell because it was just really interesting. And this took in place in Canberra in Australia. So basically, the story was that they purchased this vehicle from like Craigslist. They found the car. They went over. They looked at the car, the family, and this young guy bought the car. Now, the only thing that was really materially wrong with the car was that there were these brown stains on the seat of the car. And the guy that was selling the car is like, oh, these are coffee stains. Don't worry about it. So he takes the car home and he's driving the car. And it was a beautiful old Ford Falcon. It was in great shape. He decided he'd finish restoring it and, he'd just reupholster it or he'd cover the upholstery stains or whatever. And it was a little reason to not buy a really good car at a really great price. It's something you could fix or manage. So he buys the car and he's driving along one day with his friend, and he said that the radio was on an FM station. They're listening to music kind of loud. They're young guys, and they're, it's really pounding in the car, and they're laughing. And his buddy makes a joke about it's a great car. It's too bad there's blood stains on the seat, kind of jerking his chain and what have you. And he said all of a sudden, right after that, the steering wheel began to shake, almost like it was in an earthquake. It was just that shimmy thing, going on. And he pulls the car over, and he said he starts trying to pull the car over, and he said then the car decided to just take off, and it accelerated and almost hit the car in front of it. And he's fighting the car now, trying to hold onto the steering wheel, trying to keep it going, trying to find a place to pull over, and trying to not hit somebody else's vehicle in the process, which is definitely, a lot to be doing all at the same time. So he stopped the collision, he pulls over, he's shaken, and all of a sudden, he said as this was all going on, the radio went from the music to white noise, that snow sound you would see and hear on an old TV. And then a few seconds after he pulls over, the white noise changes. The radio changed channels from AM to F, or from FM to AM, and it went to channel 66.6. And he said it isn't coincidental. You had to push a button to make this thing move. Something was moving things in my car. So things like this began to happen, off and on. He'd have the radio channel change. The car would suddenly take a fit where it wanted to ram into another vehicle, stuff like that. He got to the point where he was afraid to drive it. And his mother said to him, look, you still have to take care of the registration work for this car. Let's get that done, and then you can sell this car and get another one. Obviously, there's something wrong with this car. Well, they ended up finding out that the car had been involved in an accident and had been written off. We call it totaled in the United States. It was totaled.
Sure.
And apparently they got a salvage title and had sold this car. They took it back to the guy they bought it from. The guy didn't seem particularly surprised to see the car return. And he bought it back. And the young man said that he lost $500, but he became very wise. And it was worth the $500 to never have to drive that car again.
That's why here in the States we have laws about full disclosure. We also have Carfax.
We do have Carfax. It's just, there's a lot of things that happen that we don't know about with our vehicles. If you ever run a Carfax report on something and you find out, oh, it was in an accident 5 years ago, or it was in a flood or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
So,
I have come across that.
particularly after the flooding down south from a couple of those hurricanes, a lot of cars came north that had been flooded. So have you ever had any odd experiences with a vehicle?
Just one. When I was traveling for the company that I worked for, had to do with cemetery. I would always take the back roads wherever I could. Nice 2-lane road. I was always looking for the shortest distance between A and B. So I had to go from Altoona to Clearfield. And I was taking the back roads. And one of the towns that I had to go through, The state route came up and then made a left-hand turn. When it did that, it went past a church and then right through the middle of a cemetery. And this is probably mid-morning, 9, 10 o'clock, somewhere around there. And as I'm looking at the road ahead of me, obviously there's no oncoming traffic. There is a mist, a human-shaped mist in the center of the road, in the middle of my lane, my travel lane. And not necessarily like a head or anything turning to look at me, or waving arms or anything like that, but just a columnar human shape. And so I'm thinking, like, this is extraordinarily odd. And so I kind of swerved to go around it. And then when I did, I looked in the rearview mirror, and if it had been a mist, a regular, a natural phenomenon, the eddy currents from a vehicle going by would have swirled and made it dissipate. But no, it stayed right there. So I just continued driving on, one eye ahead, one eye in the rearview mirror, watching this to see if it would do anything else. But as I had to get to my customer side, I didn't stick around. But it would have been interesting to see, had I had the time to pull over and just try to interact. Maybe I could have, but and that was probably easily 20 years ago.
Wow. Down in Gettysburg, you will find stories of that a lot, like people driving along on a nice clear night and seeing a solid massive mist that's the shape of a human or the height of a human, and it doesn't dissipate when they drive through it, or it doesn't change shape when they drive through it.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And it's the only spot of mist. That's a weird phenomena when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Just is.
And the thing is, because I'm in my car, and the heater, I can't remember if I had the heat going or anything. All I know is it's comfortable inside the car. And, I didn't feel a chill or anything as I went by or anything like that. So it was just one of those things that I chalk up to, well, that's paranormal.
Don't know what it is. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to kind of venture off the normal, like, haunted cars and things of that nature. There's a lot of haunted objects, but I wanted to talk about something that's a little less commonly known, and that would be electronics. So I have to tell you, I have one experience of that myself. So years and years ago, when my boys were teenagers, my youngest son and two of his friends were at the house one evening, and the one boy, Zach, is a computer person. He's always, like, got his face in a computer somewhere doing something. That's just who he is.
I can relate.
And I'm sure. And the other boy was, his name was Cody, and he was asking me a bunch of questions. I was that mom that everybody'd ask me a lot of questions because I'd sit and patiently answer. And he was asking about religion that night. He was saying, what do you think? Is there a God? That kind of stuff, And I was patiently answering him, and we were in this great discussion, him and Ben and I. Ben is my son. And Zach's just sitting there quietly clicking keys, being Zach. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, like, the air pressure in this room changed. It got cold. It was harder to breathe. I get creeps when I tell the story. I really do. Almost chills. And at the same time, some great wind whirled through the room. I don't know how else to explain it. Just as quick as could be, just whoosh, and it was gone. And the boys' necks are on a swivel. They're looking like, what the heck's happening? And I look over at Zach, and he's got this gray, pale face. And I said, Zach, are you okay? And he's like, holy crap, holy crap. I didn't do it. I didn't know it would work. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, there was this site I came up with, and it said, like, download a demon. And he's like, well, I clicked it. And he's like, then all that stuff happened. And I'm like, get off of it. Get off of it right now. Just get off of it. You could feel the evil. I don't know how to explain it. If you've ever been around an exorcism or in a place that's truly uncomfortable, it was that kind of nasty feeling. The other two boys, their eyes are as big as quarters. And he clicks off this thing and shuts the whole machine down. And I get up and I have to cleanse my entire house. Like, I literally had to say, he does not live here. He has no right to give you permission to be here. You have to leave in the name of Christ. And I go through the entire house with salt. And I clean it, and then I take the boys elsewhere. And we were actually talking about this a couple nights ago, Zach and Ben and I. We made mention of it. It was just a really creepy feeling. And I don't know what happened. I can only tell you that whatever happened, we experienced it before we knew what he was doing. So it couldn't be like a psychological issue where we
Mhm.
were anticipating it, because we didn't know anything was going on with Zach until afterward. And by then we had already had the experience of the wind. And it was interesting because it was like a rush of wind, but it didn't like knock the books off the shelf or anything, but you still felt it go by you. I don't know how else to explain that.
Mm. The air was palpable.
Yeah, it was a very odd feeling. So when I was doing the research for this particular podcast, Ghosts in the Machine, I started to come across some stuff I had never thought about. I'm not a gamer. If I have played 10 minutes of video games in the entirety of my 58 years upon this planet, I am exaggerating. That is how much I like video games. I'm not a game person at all. I'm just not. And so I never really thought about it. But for those who don't know, the internet was built by the government as a communications device, at least. And video games were created by the government and originally were used to train soldiers to be able to react in battles without having to think about it or question it. They would just do it by rote because you've already killed 1,000 people in the video game. So your inhibitions on that subject are down, and now you're just going to follow the familiar path. That was the thought process. And then eventually they were introduced into the public. So it's a really an interesting story if you get to read a little bit about the subject. And there are video games that have history to them. Some of them pretty scary and creepy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of them and share. There was one game in particular, the very first one I came across was something called the Polybus. And this happened in 1981 in Portland, Oregon. So this game was built by a German company, and they had a representative going around trying to get it into the arcades. Those of you who are young will not believe that you did not get to play video games at home, but it's true. We had to go to a place called an arcade, put quarters in the machine, and play for however many minutes that allowed you, and then feed more quarters into the machine. And you could only do that for so long till your quarters ran out and your mother's patience ran out, and then you had to go home. And so this was that kind of an arcade from the early 1980s. Now, Stu, because I'm sure you played games in video arcades, a lot of them had these great big colorful cabinets that they were in that were all, action scenes and made you want to like pick that game because it just looked so cool.
Oh yeah, just like the cover on a book. I mean, they were made to be, draws. I mean, you wanted to
Right.
see those. And most of them, the cabinets were made for one person to stand in front of them. Although some of them, eventually, they made two-player games, so you could have where you wouldn't have to switch places. You could have them both playing at the same time,
Oh,
which
okay.
is
I didn't
also
know that.
yeah. They started to make them wider, so you could have two people.
Oh.
So,
So anyhow, the games usually had those big lurid covers, on them that showed you how awesome it was to play their game. But this one, Polybus, didn't. It had a plain black cabinet with just the word Polybus written above it. And the arcade guys were a little suspicious. They were like, nah, I don't think that game's going to make us much money. I don't know that I want to give floor space to it. Because, you had to decide what games the kids would play. But they got talked into giving it a try. They're like, all right, for a little bit, but I'll be calling you to take that game out of here shortly. And it didn't seem to happen that way. To their shock and surprise, the kids that once one of the kids played the game, every kid wanted to play the game. And they would stand in long lines. They would have ignored the other video games that were free that they used to like so much. No clue why these kids all felt drawn to this game, but they did. And there was also one other really weird, quirky thing about this game. When the salesman had sold them the game on this game, he said, we'll have our techs coming in. It's a new game. We want to double check everything. So they'll be coming in every afternoon before you end your, shut your place down, and they're going to check the machine out and what have you. And don't worry about it. It won't cost you anything. It won't infringe on your time. It'll just take a couple minutes. And sure enough, every day along came these two men in suits, not work clothes, who putzed around and did something inside the game and got some data is what they said they were doing, getting data, and they left. For about a month, these games became really popular. And then one day, the video arcade people came in and found the games were gone, just gone. Like somebody had come in the middle of the night and stolen them, kind of gone. But they didn't break in. There was no signs of a break-in. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was stolen. Just the games were gone. And people have no idea to this day exactly what was going on. Obviously, something was going on. The most popular theories are that these games were being used, you know, for mind control, or like kind of an MK Ultra kind of a deal, what have you. It was just a really strange series of events. And they said that, you know, among the things that happened is that kids would report that they were having headaches, amnesia, blackouts, epileptic seizures, nausea, nightmares, hallucinations, and some kids went home after playing the games and committed suicide. So what was going on? And nobody really knows. And that's not the only report of craziness like that. You know?
Yeah, was it designed in there to do? I'm sorry. Was it designed in there to do that, or was that just incidental? Was that accidental that happened? Yeah,
that's a good question. And the question is harder to answer because you have the technicians who kept coming in and gathering all this data. So did they design it that way and then started looking to see if, you know, what was going on? How do you control these things? How do you give people these things and talk them into it? You know, I don't know. I don't have an answer. So we're going to do one more video game because I thought these were fascinating. I called my oldest son, who's a big gamer, and I was reading this stuff to him this morning, and he was like, "You hit every video game I play." So apparently there's a lot of these stories out there. But this other one that I wanted to talk about is from the Game Boy, the Nintendo Game Boy game, Pokemon Red and Green. It was introduced in 1996 and was really popular. It was originally released in Japan, and today we don't realize it, but there was a lot of controversy around the game after it was released in Japan, because allegedly there were a lot of suicides amongst kids ages 7 to 12 who played the game, almost 200 of them. And almost every suicide took place directly after playing the game. So there were other experiences that were reported, dizziness, the headaches, the nausea, hallucinations, and it seems that they all started after you hit a level called Lavender Town. So Lavender Town is a level in the game where everything's kind of overlaid with a purple hue. It's very creepy, otherworldly, and there was a soundtrack embedded with a frequency that children could hear. Now, this one I found fascinating. Like, I don't know that they deliberately set it up this way, but kids could hear it better than adults. And those kids who heard it are the ones who seem to have had the nightmares, the hallucinations, that sort of thing. And those kids seem to have a lot of ill effects from playing the game. And you had to try to play your way through this place called Lavender Town. So the company was contacted. You can imagine 200 suicides and all these other strange things going on. People were going back and complaining and wanting to know what the heck's going on. Nintendo always said it did not hide any frequencies in the music. It never set anything up to make it this way, but it did change the music and changed everything in Lavender Town before it was released internationally overseas, which would be the United States, among other places. Good question, isn't it? Mm-hmm. You know, it is. I don't know if you realize this or not, but today it's classified as an addiction. And it's treated like an addiction. I mean, there are kids that play video games, you know, 7, 10, 12 hours a day. Not just kids either, adults. It's a really, to the detriment of living their lives. You know, you can't really live much of a life if you're spending 12 hours a day playing a video game.
Not really. Not especially if you're school age.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. And then one last video game. This one's more of a traditional type of haunting, and this was a game that was called Majora's Mask. It's not about the game itself so much as about who played it. So when my kids were young, I noticed that they played a video game for like 2 or 3 weeks and then they were done with it. So I refused to spend $70 on a game that in 3 weeks was going to go under their bed. I found that you could trade video games at secondhand shops. Like you could buy it for $10. She'd give you $5 off. She could resell it for $10 and then she'd give us, you know, another game. So that's what we would do. And among those games, you would sometimes come across pirated or bootlegged games that had like a piece of masking tape on it and it said, you know, such and such game, right?
Right.
And this story centers around somebody who wrote into, I think it was 4chan, and told this story that he bought this game as a college student secondhand from an old guy that ran one of those secondhand type shops, and he puts it in the machine. He's going to play it, and up pops a file that's saved. You know, they save their stats and how far they've gone in the games and things like that. And it said Ben, which is nothing unusual. Somebody else had played it, so obviously Ben was the guy playing the game, and Ben, you know, doesn't have the game anymore. So the kid, he ignores it, that file. He opens up a new player and he starts playing the game. But the game is just riddled with all these glitches and like there's textures moving in the inside of the graphics, and the music's playing weird, and sometimes the game runs backwards. It's just weird. So as this is happening, he's like, oh man, this thing's corrupted. It's really crappy. And it's calling me Ben. He wouldn't take it. It took his name. It seemed like it took his name. But then whenever he started to play, it came back up to Ben. And he said, it said two things to him. The game talked to him and it said, you shouldn't have done that. And you met with a terrible fate, haven't you? So he decided to delete the file and for Ben and start all over. Maybe he could, Ben's file was corrupted. So he gets the file out of there and he continues, he starts trying to play the game. And then the word drowned starts appearing in the background, just the word drowned. And it's just popping up randomly throughout the game. You could play the game, but that word just kept popping up all the time. And he's like, that's really lame. Why the heck do they have that word popping up? Drowned. So he said he took the game back and he asked the old guy, you know, where'd you get this thing at? It doesn't work right. And the guy said, well, this fella came in and said that his little boy had these games, his teenage, you know, his son, 10 or 12-year-old son, but he didn't need them anymore. He died in a drowning accident and he just needed to get rid of all this stuff. What a coincidence. You know, and the thought that you can just pick up a random game and, you know, and it has something attached to it already is just really terrifying. I want to talk a little bit about, there's something called the Apostolic Clock, which sits in Hershey. And this was probably one of my favorite stories because I actually got to see the clock years and years ago.
Okay.
So down in Hershey Museum, there's this beautiful clock, and it is at least, you know, high. It's just this beautiful clock. And it comes in all these different layers. Like you literally put it together like you would a cake. And every layer has all this stuff going on. The clock tells you everything under the sun. It tells you the minutes, the seconds, the hour, the phases of the moon, the months, the signs of the zodiac, the date, everything you can imagine this clock does. And every 15 minutes, Father Time comes out and he strikes the bell for the 15-minute mark. And then in the quarter of the hour, several mechanical figures, Christ leading the way and the 12 disciples, come across one of the other levels. And they go all the way through and disappear until the next hour. And then they do that again. But I was talking to the docent when I was down there, and the docent said, you know, there's a story that goes with this clock. And He told us all the history. He said the clock was built by a guy by the name of John Feaster over 11 years. He began traveling in 1878 throughout Pennsylvania. He would take the clock and assemble it, and he would charge people 10 cents to see the clock. That, people would be so amazed with this clock, they would either buy clocks from him or get theirs repaired. And eventually the clock was sold to a gentleman by the name of George Danner in Mannheim. And later on in 1935, Milton Hershey of Hershey Park fame would buy the Danner collection, and it would become part of the Hershey collection. And he said, we've had people tell us that, and people have claimed to have seen that every so often it's random, which is interesting because everything in his clock literally works on clockwork. So it has to on track, and it has to do it on a certain cycle, what have you, that a figure, a red figure that looks like the devil, will come out. His hands are kind of up like he's ready to grab something. The last figure, one of the apostles, is Judas Iscariot. And that this figure will lean forward, touch Judas Iscariot, and then Judas Iscariot and the satanic figure will flip down inside of the clock and disappear. But there is no satanic figure in the clock. Like, they tear it apart, they work on the clock, they have to make sure there's no dirt on the tracks, oil everything. That figure doesn't exist. There's no place for them to fall down into that wouldn't be damaging other parts of the works. But yet people have insisted that they have seen this.
Time to look at security camera footage.
Yeah, seriously, it's an interesting story, isn't it?
It is.
I found it really interesting. And I have to tell you, it's a beautiful piece. I was trying to find out if it was on display right now, and it is not. At last I heard, which was about a 6-month-old review, somebody talked about it had been pulled into conservatorship because they're not able to find somebody right now who knows how to maintain the clock. And so they've pulled it off, the showroom, so that you can't see it on the museum floor there until they can find somebody who's able to take care of the clock and make sure that the works are running properly. This clock was put together out of 3 other clocks. And interestingly enough, the man who built it was not a clockmaker originally. And so it runs a little, it damages the clock a little bit when it runs because he kind of jury fit everything together to make it work. And there's extra wear and tear inside the works of the clock, so it has to be maintained.
And that kind of skilled labor is probably becoming extraordinarily rare.
Definitely becoming extraordinarily rare. We are losing a lot of amazing things because we are not training people up who know how to do them, have a passion for them, sadly. So hopefully they find somebody who's able to care for that clock. It's extraordinary, and I highly recommend if taking the trip to Hershey. Obviously there's a lot of stuff to do in Hershey, but that is the thing that I always liked the most, was when we got to go to the museum and I could see that clock work. We took my son down, my oldest son down there multiple times, and it was always my favorite part of the trip to see the clock.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine. Yeah.
It's like a wonder to look at it. We think of clocks as these $10 things that hang on the wall. This thing was a show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was in Germany in the Air Force, the base that I was based at in the city of Wiesbaden, they claimed to have the world's largest cuckoo clock, and it was like the entire front of a store. This thing was huge. Now, whether that was the world's largest one or not, I don't know. But I mean, you could go inside the store and you could see all the workings from the back and everything, which was fascinating. But yeah, you could get your picture taken in front of it.
Wow, that sounds cool.
As far as I know, it wasn't haunted though. It didn't have a satanic cuckoo or anything that came out.
Well, hey, you can't have everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to tell one last story and let it go. This one is, I found it interesting because it shouldn't exist. So in Stockholm, Sweden, they have a large subway system that they use quite a lot. And all the subway trains are painted green. That's their the color for the subways. They're green,
Mhm.
except for one. It's called the Silver Arrow or the Silver Pylon. I hope I pronounced that right. I gave it my best shot, everybody. So it's interesting because this train, it looks like a bullet. It's aluminum colored, and it really isn't supposed to be there. So it says, the riders of the green trains that are part of the subway system will occasionally see it flashing by. They glimpse the train, but nobody knows where it's at, where it's going. And I find this fascinating because there's no accident. And at trains, whether they're on the railroad tracks or they're in a subway, that's a dance, a choreographed dance to keep everything going in the appropriate way
Absolutely.
without, it's amazing. If you ever looked at because I'm more familiar with train tracks, a train schedule and what the engineers had to do when they were scheduling to make sure everybody got through on certain tracks at certain times and everything had to stay in sync. It was science to do this. It's amazing. They have down to the minutes. You have X number of minutes to get through, then we got to flip the lines so that someone else can get through, and then we're going to have to move you off to a side track so we can get this person through, and then you can, it's just so complicated. But it's interesting because they claim they see this train occasionally, usually after midnight. So it's usually late at night when it goes whistling by. And they say there's nobody at the controls. The train doesn't stop. At least most of the time it doesn't. It just makes the circuit, whatever it's doing. It's seen on different routes, and they can't explain that. There are stories, or a legend, if you will, attached that the train does stop on occasion on isolated stops, and anybody who gets inside is never seen again.
I'll keep that in mind if I'm ever in Sweden.
And don't get on the silver train, dude. Don't get on the silver train. So is it a phantom train? Is it carrying people to death or a different dimension or what? It's a really interesting story, and interesting to me because I'm a train girl. I love trains. Altoona was railroad capital of the world, and I grew up with trains. My dad and my grandparents were all train people. I have great memories with trains, all the way through my childhood.
Mhm.
And when we do a set of ghost stories about trains, I will tell you a little bit more about all that. But there are stories of other trains in other places that don't exist, that show up and stop and let people aboard and then disappear. This is not an isolated case. I've collected them over the years.
I
Not shocked?
of that I have no doubt.
Not shocked, are we?
No, not at all.
So,
Mhm.
but I find it fascinating, the whole concept that something as large as a train or, a subway train can just come out of nowhere. It's mythical to me, and go through the system and make people disappear.
I've been digging into some science-y kind of things lately, and one of the things that's been fascinating me is the fourth dimension.
Okay.
Okay. And how, if there was a four-dimensional being in a four-dimensional world coexisting with ours, if they moved an object, a four-dimensional object, through our three-dimensional space, it would look like magic to us. It would be like something just appeared, it would move, and then it'd disappear. Or something from our world, our three-dimensional world, could be taken away and returned, flipped 180 degrees, a mirror image of it. So that kind of thing, just I'm fascinated by the science behind it, and it's just so that kind of thing. I'm thinking like that could explain an awful lot of things that we've talked about during this entire podcast series, of just things that we may think of as otherworldly, when in fact maybe, well, to us there really is another world, but then it's just another dimension. So
So it's
I don't want to
interesting you
delve
said
into
that.
that. Yeah.
No, because it's interesting because I actually have slated for us down the road when I grasp everything a little better. and I feel like I have a good set of stories to tell, that idea of multiple dimensions. And one of the things that I was collecting for that was stories of people who have slipped in and out of dimensions and come back to tell the tale.
Yeah, it's again, Hollywood is the basis for many of the lay people's,
Right.
perception of something like that, and it's like, well, isn't time and isn't space self-correcting? Yeah, not really.
No, not so much.
It doesn't work that way. Hmm.
But anyhow, that was my last story for tonight. I wanted to leave you with the silver arrow. There's a ton of these great stories of ghosts in the machines, ghostly machines, things that are possessed, and what have you. The video game one, I have to admit, kind of freaked me out because they're in everybody's home today. And my kids played them. And like I said, I called my oldest son this morning, and I'm like, let me tell you a couple stories. I want to warm up for today.
Oh,
And I started telling him, and he was like, you hit every game I play. Because there are some other great stories about games that are very popular, Fallout and different other games that they play.
that one that freaked me out the most, and I'll have to say, is the one with your son's friend Zach conjuring the demon, or downloading the demon. That was just, especially since you had a front row seat.
Yeah, like I said, I was not paying any attention to Zach because Zach was that kid who would sit there and play and he would just interject, look up and interject into the conversation from time to time. And then when this all happened in that few seconds, he was sitting directly across from me in the living room, and I looked up and he had this ashen, panicked look on his face. It was that, oh crap look, And I said, Zach, what's wrong? What did you do? And he goes, I didn't think it was real. He cussed, and then he said, I didn't think it was real. And then he started to tell me that he had found this website. He had saved it to get onto it. While we were talking about God and religion, he just, his brain kind of took it in that direction. So he clicked on the site and he downloaded a demon, or he did something. But isn't it just another avenue? At the end of the day, I had to think about this. A lot of things cannot attach to you until you let them. Isn't that just another way of inviting them? And why wouldn't they use it?
Well, that makes sense now that you've stated that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, a lot of times that's what you hear, is that evil has to be, a lot of times it has to be invited in some fashion. It may be very oblique how it does it, and you may not realize that's what you're doing, but at the end of the day, that's what you did. And if you click that button saying, I want you in my life, is it any really different than getting on a Ouija board or working some spell in the Middle Ages?
Or letting the black-eyed children into your house. Yeah,
exactly.
To go back a few episodes. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But we don't think about those two things going together. So it's a great scam if that's what they're doing. So I am done. I will let you get going. I know you have all this other stuff to do.
Well, it's just, it seems like the older you get, the more things you have to do. But we want to also remind all of our listeners and viewers that if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do. There's the subscribe button right here, and then click the bell that's right there, and you'll get notified when we publish new content, which we're trying to do on a weekly basis. But as we're getting into the warmer seasons, that's probably going to change a little bit, because those of us who are homeowners have a whole bunch more projects that we have to do.
And I have some speaking gigs and stuff I have to pull off this summer that I've promised other people, but we'll work our way through it all.
So yeah, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you are already subscribed, we thank you very much, and tell your friends. Word of mouth is how we're trying to get by right now. We have our Facebook page, The Paranormalist Podcast. We have the email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. And all those avenues are always open. And again, we remain anonymous if you'd like to be. Like the last episode where we had, a couple of users, they didn't mind having at least their first names, given. I mean, whatever you desire, but it's a safe space. So don't feel like you're going to be criticized or ridiculed or anything like that, we'll listen.
Yeah, and I actually did contact both the users and asked them if it would be okay to use their first names in it. And yeah, go there and check it out. There's all kinds of really interesting things, and that's a wonderful little paranormal community that we're developing there. People are sharing all the time about things that have happened in their lives.
Excellent. So again, Patty, we appreciate all your stories. We appreciate our listeners and viewers. And with that, I will bid you adieu.
The same to you, my friend.
Good night.
Good night.